Hello, games, plays, and races in ancient Rome. Uh, Rome, like Greece, put a lot of emphasis on recreation, athleticism, uh, p- performances of plays, festivals, and so forth. Um, Rome, during its Republic days, start these annual games called the Ludi, and they were initially started with sort of a patron client relationship, a way to keep the urban poor sort of more in line, contented, as the Roman Republic grew more and more into an empire. Excuse me. There were banquets, parades, animal hunts, athletic contests, all sorts of things that revolved around sort of various forms of entertainment. There was circus, theaters, chariot races, sort of a procession of triumphant generals coming and celebrating victories in foreign lands. It was a way for, as it says here, sort of a unity in sacrifice, a unity in religion, civic religion, a way to bring people together, and have a shared sense of being, sense of purpose, sense of history, a sense of a future, and so forth. And a lot of it was portrayed in these games. Around the 300s BCE, to the end of the Republic, and around the year 40, about 74 days a year, and roughly 1 in 5 days a year, were spent on these celebrations. The Ludi Romani were the initial ones, and these were, days that would start in April and go to November. There were 17 days in April, there were 3 days in May, there were 19 days in July, 15 in September, and so forth, and finally 14 in November, that they would celebrate, in Rome and throughout the empire, well, throughout the realm, which becomes an empire by the end of this period. Uh, Over time, more and more of these games were added, and more days were added as well. And by the 300s Common Era, by the, well past the high water mark of the empire, 177 days, roughly half the year, were devoted just to celebrations, and a number of other types of celebrations, to different gods, and to focusing on different things. Sort of the last one, it was devoted to the theater and so forth. So lots of the time during the year was focused on, playing, entertainment, trying to keep people amused. These games were a time when you had uh, lots of people everywhere. You had lots of folks who were idle, who were going to these games. The urban poor looked for recreation, entertainment, but it was also a time when people had jobs. There were these games employed scores and scores, hundreds of actors. Charioteers, seen here is one of the most well-known charioteers, Gaius Appuleius Diocles, the highest paid athlete of the first century uh, first century CE. He was a charioteer. There were gladiators who were mostly slaves. There were patrons, military leaders, emperors, those who sort of were engaged in or sponsoring these events, or actors, charioteers making money from these events. Gladiators, although they didn't make money, they sometimes got prizes. They could become very well known. Rare cases, they were able to see opportunities for advancement beyond being a slave. Uh, there also were jobs that were sort of not direct jobs, but vendors, people who were selling food, drinks, different items, different. You'll see some things later in this talk about trinkets and things and sculptures, and there were lots of prostitutes who were, selling their wares as well in and around these games. Slaves were a major part of this. A lot of the labor was done by slaves. A lot of the, the everything from sort of being a gladiator to putting the canopy out at the Colosseum were done by slaves. Sometimes in these games, in these theaters, in these carnival atmosphere, in the stadiums, the crowd, the people was a sense of, coming together, empowerment, democracy, you might want to say, where everybody was able to boo and cheer, and everybody was in the same venue, watching the same teams, supporting the same athletes, seeing the same plays. But also, it was, although there was an element of equality or democracy in these events, social status was regularly maintained, so seating and access, and where the emperor sat, where the patron sat, where the plebes sat, was different than where the patricians sat. And it was still, there was an element of democracy. There was a sort of a empowerment to some respect of the plebes, of the people, but for the most part, it was still socially segregated, where the wealthy maintained control of over these events, and largely sponsored them for that reason. Excuse me. Parades, sacrifice, banquets, and fun. This is a picture of an amphitheater, of a theater. It was I think it believes in Turkey today, but it was you start these things off with at a temple. You sacrifice to a god, you proceed sort of a carnival-like atmosphere. There's many days of theater, oftentimes the Romans, this was something I said before, where you empowered many of the people, and they felt as though comedy was valued more over tragedy or drama. And the farce, where the audience were participating, they would hoot and yell and cheer and scream, and become part of the actual performance at times. There was a lot of bringing bears onto stages, or having boxing on stage, or violence on stage. The crowd was very much an urban poor crowd, maybe not as refined as you would think. And they wanted violence, they wanted action, they wanted to feel good, they wanted to feel more than think sometimes, which is sometimes a lot different than what we have seen in Greece, where thinking might have been valued more over the feeling part of it. There was cabaret, pantomime, burlesque, sexuality, violence was very much part of these plays, and everyone wanted to go home feeling good, whether it was physical or mental. They wanted to go home feeling as though they'd been part of something that was special, and it had a good feeling inside when they got home. Another picture of a theater. This is another one. This is the one on the right here is actually from Italy, and this is on the left. How it might look when it was filled. This is people coming in, people selling their goods. There's the canopy if it was a rainy day or a sunny day, a canopy sheltering. The folks would go over here and shelter many of the people inside the theater. As I said before, love always wins. Love conquers all. Slaves fool masters. Politicians were mocked. It was sort of a carnival-like feel in these amphitheaters, and people, the world was turned upside down. Again, an empowering moment for people who are urban poor to feel as though they had a sense of control of their lives that they maybe probably didn't have in everyday existence. Another part beyond the theater were the chariot races. The chariot races were our modern day professional football, or if you're someone who lives abroad, it's modern day soccer. This was the sport that everyone followed. This was a sport that everyone really imbibed in. You had their teams, you had your favorite racers, you had Diocles was the one I mentioned before with the picture of him, the most highly paid athlete of the first century. This is Scorpus seen here with his horse. He was a very well-known charioteer. He won over 2,000 races. He tragically died at the age of 27 of an accident. But they became household names. They became heroes in much the way our athletes today do, whether it be LeBron James or Tiger Woods, or you name your favorite sport and your favorite athlete, Messi or whomever it might be. There were four major teams in the chariot races: the Reds, it's got a typo there, the Whites, the Reds, not the Reeds, the Whites, the Reds, the Blues, and the Greens. The races would start when you had a local official, a patron, an important person in the bureaucracy, someone who was a politician, who would drop a napkin. Someone would blow a trumpet, drop a napkin, the race would begin. There were lots of different types of races: 4 horses, 2 horses, trick riding, all kinds of things that would entertain the crowd. It was not just red versus white versus blue versus green. It was a lot of different races as well, but you would end up with these teams and victories, and you'd have your flags and your colors, and you had your team you picked. Most people would have their favorite teams, and they would, much like we have today, we would root for who we believed was our favorite. All over the empire, they had these venues. Circus Maximus in Rome itself was the largest. It had over 250,000 seats. Can you imagine that? The largest sports stadium that we have today is 100,000, and this was 2.5 times larger than that. I'm going to show you a picture of what it looked like in a minute, but they had clubhouses, they had suites, 7 laps around the course. It equals 1 race, 24 races a day, prizes for winners, palm crowns and gold chains and gold necklaces and things, and ultimately money for the victors. In Rome itself, there was a place called Campus Martius, which was an area of Rome where people trained. There were chariot race venues there. There was places there to play and train, stables, trainers, blacksmiths, a whole world of people largely in Rome that was devoted to prepare for these races, to train for these races, which again, if you're having them, if you're having entertainment days or holiday days or these ludi 177 days a year, these are be quite common events in Rome itself. So the theaters, the carnival aspect leading up to the end of these days, which would be the chariot races, it's a lot of big business. It's very meaningful to you as a sports venue, a sports outlet, as a entertainment outlet, something for fun. But it's big business as well. People owned these teams. People managed these teams. There are boards of directors for those teams. So you wanted to get the best horses and the best equipment and the best technology and the best riders and all that as well. So you had to train them. And I'll show you where that was in a little bit. Just a scene from clearly not a real race, but what it might look like back in the day. Spectators, you have your colors: blue racer, green racer, different types of races and so forth, with either 2 horses or 4 horses and so forth. This is a recreation of what Circus Maximus might have looked like. This is Palatine, the emperor's quarters up here. And next to it was Circus Maximus, with seating all along this way and seating all along this way. And you have some folks who are shaded, and some folks who have their suites. And 1 lap around here, 7 times is a race, and different types of races. It was, imagine the spectacle, the scope. If Rome was 1 million people, a quarter of Rome was inside this venue on a given chariot race. It's amazing to think that a full quarter of the people of entire city was in this at a race like this. But it's another picture of what it looked like. Again, this is the emperor's castle, Palatine, and this is the Circus Maximus again. And just to show you what some of the suites, the boxes that you have today, what it looked like in there and so forth, and some of the nicer seating as well. But it's just it's amazing to think how big this was, how much money was put into this, and how important this was to both Romans who were wealthy, middling Romans and poor Romans, and just how many people something like this would employ as well, and how many slaves were at the root of helping this function. This is Circus Maximus today. This is the royal palaces. This is Circus Maximus. Clearly, it's a ruin. And what I've shown you before were recreations or representations of what they thought it looked like back in the day. Um, and this is where things were. So this is Circus Maximus. This is the emperor's castle. I shouldn't say castle, emperor's buildings, the Palatine. The Colosseum, which is going to be built a little bit later, was just nearby, near to this. You see these are walls within walls. So you have a wall here, this blue line, there's a wall here, the orange line, there's a wall here, the pink line. There's a wall here. There's the walls within walls for protection, different sections of cities and so forth. This area here, this pink area, this is Campus Martius. So that's how big it was. This is where that large section of the city was devoted toward training individuals, training horses, maintaining the equipment, the technology, practicing for these events that would take place in Rome. And of course, this happened not just in Rome, it happened all across the empire, but Rome, of course, being the center of it at this time is why there's the focus. Also, part of this, not exactly part of this, but something that grew into becoming very important entertainment as well, were the gladiator shows. The Ludi were the games, the Munero were the gladiator shows. This is not really this part of the games. You know, the games were theaters, games were carnival, the games ended with banquets and celebrations and the chariot races. These grew separate. So if you had 177 days of Ludi, you also had a lot of days of gladiator shows. So they didn't really take hold early on, but you start seeing them taking hold a little bit later, and they become almost more important or more associated with the Roman Empire than the chariot races or the games as we get to the later part of the empire, because we have sort of taken shine to or a glorification of the gladiators in our 21st century popular culture. They were separate, you know. They start in the 200s BCE, and they really weren't public displays. They were celebrations of a life. Somebody had died, and part of their funeral rites were sort of competitions. Wealthy folks would have competitions of their slaves, or to fight to celebrate the memory of a fallen wealthy person. And you start seeing in the literature more and more of this as time moves forward. You start seeing it in 216 BCE, 22 pairs of gladiators fought at a funeral. In 183 BCE, at the funeral of Crassus, you saw 60 pairs of folks fighting at the funeral. But then people get the idea, this is interesting, this is fascinating, it's exciting, people are dying, there's blood, there's competition, there's athleticism, we like these things. And by the 100s, the low 100s BCE, you start seeing bleachers and grandstands and people selling tickets at these events, and it becoming more of a show than it being a remembrance of a fallen wealthy person. So what you see then is you start seeing, as a show becomes more important than the original meaning, you start seeing, just like what you saw with the plays, just like what you saw with Circus Maximus, how do you make this more interesting? How do you make this more fun? It was a spectacle of gore, blood, and you bring in things like ostriches and lions and zebras and giraffes and always elephants. Elephants were always part of this, right? You bring in animals that people don't see on a common basis, leopards and so forth, and you have staged hunts. And just imagine, you know, they would have this at Circus Maximus before the Colosseum was built, and they'd have them all over the place at different venues. So it was not just in the Colosseum, but all over the place in Rome, all over the place in the empire. In one 5-day period, in 55 BCE, you saw 600 lions and 400 leopards being killed in Circus Maximus at staged hunts. It's hard to imagine that, and as far as endangered species goes, not exactly a great way to to preserve animals. But again, there was no concern, obviously, about that back in those days. You'd have pitched battles, you'd have, naval battles, you'd have infantry battles with cavalry and infantry and elephants, and all this, of course, all the folks who are participating in these events and the gladiators, all these folks are slaves. Very rarely do you have someone who's a non-slave as part of this. It happens, but most of this is slaves. So you have 400 slaves, 1,000 slaves, 4,000 slaves as oarsmen, dozens of boats, 2,000 fighters who are all slaves who are sort of acting this role, but a role that would mean life or death. It's not going to end well for many of these folks who are gladiators. Um, uh, Naval battles, they would flood Circus Maximus, they would flood other other venues, bring water in from the Tiber, bring water in from the Mediterranean, different places throughout the empire, nearest local water source, and have real battles like this, where you have oarsmen, where you have fighters on the ships. It's just trying to make the crowd, bring war to life, bring violence to their doorstep, always protecting the crowd, but yet making the crowd sort of see what they only have read about or heard about, or may have witnessed many years before, if they ever themselves were engaged in a conflict like this. But remember, most of these people are just poor urban dwellers, and this is very entertaining, very fascinating for them, and it really is a way to make them, get them entertained and get their minds off the problems of their own life, which is a way to really mollify and pacify a people. The Colosseum was built in 80 CE, the Common Era, and had 50,000 seats. A ruin of it is seen here still. And when it opened up, the first 100 days after it opened up, there was 100 days of festivities where they had gladiator fights and other carnival-like atmosphere throughout the city of Rome to celebrate the opening of the Colosseum. On sunny days, they would bring out this canopy, and they would actually have slaves moving the canopy all around the top of the stadium, so that they could give shade to the patrons. And it was an engineering feat, and they would undo it when the day was over. It was, again, a lot of this is being, not only is the fighting done by slaves, but a lot of the maintenance of the facilities done by slaves. As we said many times before, Rome was a slave society. The gladiators did lots of things. Again, gladiators were slaves, all right, and people owned these people, and you always get the sense that when you fight, all the gladiators who fight would die, and many gladiators who fought did die. So it was not a long lived life expectancy if you were a gladiator, but people owned them, and people who owned these slaves who fought as gladiators didn't want them to die, of course, because it was part of their business, part of their profits, part of their stable, if I do say so, of ready gladiators. And if you do the thumbs up or the thumbs down and you kill gladiators, or gladiators are killed in battle, it's a loss of income, a loss of revenue, a loss of your net worth if you lose gladiators. So, they really didn't like that they would be killed, and they did all they could so to limit the death, the violence, the theater, the spectacle was obviously enhanced, but there was a lot of death. But they tried very hard not to make it one man standing at the end of all these fights. They wanted to keep a lot of folks alive, because it was their living, it was their source of wealth for many of these folks. So slaves did this. The wealthy kept a stable of ready gladiators. Many of the wealthy, there were schools of gladiators. There were schools in Rome. There were schools throughout the empire. There were individuals who were wealthy who kept sort of their own schools in their estates, and you could be part of different types of schools. The Hoplo Machi, there's a missing letter there. It should be an A here. Were the heavily armored gladiators, the retiari, the net and daggers, the sort of the pitchfork and the dagger and things, or a knife and a dagger. The Esed, Dari, and the Equites were the ones who were gladiators who rode horseback or were on chariots in venues as well. And the bestiarii were the ones who were staging the hunts and killing animals, and sometimes animals would kill them too. If you're in in a venue with a lion is not going to necessarily roll over and die for you. So you have to fight it. And if you weren't a skilled gladiator who knew how to kill a lion, you would be yourself badly injured or killed. So this was a business. This was a business, and you, just like with the Campus Martius, you were training a lot, and there was a lot of effort. You trained more than you actually performed. Just like any sport, right? You practice more than you play. Why do you practice more than you play? Because you need to be good at it. These are professionals, professional fighters, professional chariot racers, professional athletes, and it was a lot of effort put into Campus Martius for the gladiators, and a lot of effort put into these gladiator schools to make these people very trained and skilled athletes who would beat other trained, skilled athletes for the entertainment of the masses. These are different types of things gladiators had. Seen up here is a gladiator flask. These are real artifacts. Shin guards, like we have in soccer today. These are shin guards that gladiators wore. This was the trident that some people had with their net. They had a net and dagger, a net and a trident. This would be worn on your hand, so sort of like an axe that you could use in one hand. If you had a knife in the other, or an axe in one, you could doubly increase your killing capacity. This is a sword on the bottom here. It's a sword that was used. Clearly, it's not in the same kind of shape it was back when it was used in the gladiator shows. And two different types of helmets that they used in the gladiators. This is the more traditional helmet. This was a rougher looking helmet than the other one, but this was you've seen these things probably in pop culture, in movies, and these are the actual artifacts in museums today that gladiators used. The games were usually what this is seen here is something that was being sold, carving of a gladiator fighter that it was a toy for children, or something that you would use if you were a fan. You could bring it to the event. You take it home with you, sort of like a souvenir, mind you, that they had back in the Roman times. Every morning, these games would start with wild beast hunts. Around midday, around lunchtime, there'd be mock battles, the naval battles, the army battles. Sometimes you'd have amateurs trying out, which would be great fun for the crowd. Sort of like karaoke night. If you go out singing or something, we want to see how you can do it. This is the time we'd execute criminals, over lunch. Yeah, nice, right? If you later in the empire, when you had folks like Diocletian and others who were maybe earlier, even with Nero, this is when you executed the traitors. Christians were part of this later on as well. It's, in the last thing, so you have Act 1, the wild beast hunts. Act 2 would be this lunchtime period, sort of building up to Act 3, which is when skilled gladiators fought in pairs in the afternoon. They'd fight in pairs. They'd have a teammate at first until they were the last one standing. And again, not everyone died, but they would be the last one standing. And sometimes then they would fight each other and see who the victor would be. But skilled gladiators, life expectancy was not long, but it was a way for them in their lifetime. Gladiators were slaves, and they rarely got freedom, even successful ones. But they were able to have a lot of they enjoyed the fruits of victory, if that's what you want to say, if they were successful. They were given praise. They became heroes. They became they might have had gifts. They had women. They were people who had ultimately, though, they were in a profession where they knew they had to live hard and fast, and they wouldn't live long in most cases. And it was, you would never want to be a gladiator. You would never want to be a slave in Roman society. Even if you were somebody who was a gladiator who was successful, eventually you're going to, not be that successful. But I digress. Anyway, St. Augustine, speaking in the much later in the empire, was obviously somebody you will know as a Christian later on, who was very important in forming a lot of Christian ideas in the late empire. he went to the gladiator fights, and when he'd go there, he said, "I know it's wrong. I know it's wrong. It's bloodlust. People love to see it. I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't stop going. I had to keep going again and again because it was just so enticing." And that's a lot of how we see things today. The Romans weren't too different than us. The Romans had a bloodlust. When we see an accident, we have to turn our heads and watch. What we like seeing blood sports, we like seeing big hits in soccer or football, and the fights and hockey, and it's again, if you see it over and over again, it becomes commonplace. The first time you see a fight, the first time you see an accident, the first time you see a gladiator fight, you can't believe how awful it is. But if you see it 5, 10, 15, 20 times, the violence becomes less malicious and more benign, and it becomes more acceptable. And that's kind of how it got with the Romans. They were not that different than us, really. But they were, it was, again, these games, these plays, these races, this violence was part of their life, and it was a very important part of their life that was meaningful to them. I was gonna stop sharing right now. Meaningful to them, and something that helped maintain order and maintain acceptance and unify the empire for a very long time, from the 300s BCE all the way until the end of the Roman Empire and the beginning of the Christian era.